remember how many years, but at least a decade ago, Caroline Kelly, who was the founder of the Avner Foundation,
Yes.
contacted me. I honestly don't recall how she, why specifically she found me, reached out to me, but asked me if I would be willing to participate as a scientific advisor for this kind of burgeoning organization. And I had a lovely conversation with her, and I was glad to help because my passion is curing pancreas cancer. So that began the relationship with the organization, which is now Pankind. Yes, so I am a physician scientist, and I really became aware of the fact that working in both worlds was my passion when I was a fellow training in surgical oncology long ago at MD Anderson Cancer Center. And it really emerged from the fact that I was very interested in pancreas cancer from very early on, and realized that while I enjoyed patient care and doing surgery, that there was not going to be major advances in the treatment of these patients without research. And I always tell our trainees that surgery and research are very, very complementary from the standpoint of they're very different. One gives you very immediate gratification. You don't really generate a lot of new knowledge, but you have an outcome that you expect. And the other is exactly the opposite, which is discovery, unexpected, long timelines. So they're complementary, which I really enjoy. So bringing research insights into the clinic is what I'm most passionate about. And a lot of it comes from trying to work with human tissue as part of your research, which as a surgeon, you're advantaged because you have the most access to human tissue. And so we try to do a lot of our work and discovery using human tissue. We've been, I think, innovators in using human tissue for experiments, looking at novel therapeutics, and therefore making the findings hopefully more applicable to human disease. There are a lot of pressures right now, particularly in the United States, on research and research funding that are quite trying. I think that there's nothing else you can do except keep on, and really it's certainly forced us to try to think creatively and kind of much like your retirement portfolio that you like to be diversified. You have to diversify your sources of funding, whereas before, at least in the United States, we could rely a lot on the federal government. Now we have to think about foundations, such as Pankind, as well as philanthropic funding. Now partnering with industry is really important, and there are other kind of evolving, methods of funding like venture philanthropy. So basically pulling every lever possible to keep the wheels of progress moving forward. It's clear that you're not trained initially as a scientist to go out and try to raise funds. You're trained to do the best science, and with the assumption that that will be enough, and other skill sets are now important. The initial publication by Dave's lab and our lab about the first genetically engineered mouse model definitely was groundbreaking. And I say to a lot of my trainees, sometimes the first thing you do might be the most impactful thing you do. Hopefully not, but it has led to an incredible number of insights about the disease, and really I think helped grow the field, which may be its biggest contribution, because it allowed people to have models that they could work with that were sustainable, and then that could be built on. I don't think necessarily it's translated into approved drugs or technologies as quickly as we hoped it would, but I think its impact is undeniable. Yes, we were awarded a grant from the Lustgarten Foundation. Actually, we were first awarded a grant from a local foundation in San Diego called CureBound, which we then leveraged to partner with Lustgarten to fund this study on a Syk inhibitor. Syk is a kinase that is interestingly expressed almost exclusively on myeloid cells. And our lab, so macrophages, monocytes, our lab worked with the lab of a young investigator at UC San Diego, Shweta Joshi, who was studying Syk in the context of other cancers. And what we know about Syk is that it programs these myeloid cells to be immunosuppressive. And if you can inhibit it, it reprograms them into an inflammatory or anti-cancer phenotype. And so we showed that using that drug, which actually the convenient thing is there is a approved Syk inhibitor, which is approved for a blood disease, and it's a safe oral drug. And we showed that combining it with gemcitabine chemotherapy was synergistic in multiple models of pancreas cancer. And so we're examining it in resectable patients where we can give it before surgery, get tissue, examine the effects on the immune microenvironment, and that trial is open, accruing. We've resected about 8 patients already. No patient so far on the study has had progressive disease, so we're very excited about that, but it's still early days, but something that we're excited to have translated from our laboratories into patients. I do clearly think the field is at a turning point, and I think, obviously this energy is driven primarily by the advent of inhibitors of RAS, inhibitors specifically of KRAS and drugs that inhibit, all RAS, both HRAS and RAS and KRAS. And these drugs, which years ago we thought we would never have, but dreamed that if we would have them, they would be transformational, and now they're here. I think that, we have to temper our enthusiasm a little bit because I think it's clear they're not going to be the magic bullet we hoped they would be, but they are going to change the field and dramatically change how we treat patients and how long patients will live, and certainly we're going to enable cures in patients we couldn't before. So it's clearly an inflection point and very exciting. Tissue in pancreas cancer has been, always a challenge to get for lots of reasons, and the tumor microenvironment is very complex, and that complexity requires a huge amount of information and data to sort through. And the more investigators you have working together, sharing insights, the faster things will move. And it's a disease everyone thinks about as a very common disease because when you hear about it, patients traditionally have not done well, and so, but it's really not a super common disease on the level of things like breast cancer or lung cancer. And so the sharing of information and the sharing of resources, especially tissue-based resources, is really critical to making more rapid progress. Well, the first thing that stands out to me, because I've been observing the space now for over a decade, is the incredible increase in the number of investigators working on pancreas cancer and the sophistication of the work that's being done across the continuum of the field, from the microenvironment to early detection to innovation like nanotechnologies. And so for a country which is, population-wise less than 1/10 the size of the United States, it's quite impressive to see the really explosion in research in the field, again, across a number of different domains. So I'm very boring in terms of what I wanted to be when I was growing up, because what I wanted to be when I was growing up was a doctor. So I always tell people I never wanted to be an astronaut or a baseball player, but I do love sports. And so I guess if I was blessed with the talent, an athlete, or maybe just like a sports media person. So, yeah.